conversations. And the first thing that I'd like you to do is take a look at the tables in front of you. They all still have PQI mugs on them. We like those mugs, but not so much that we want to pack them all up and bring them home at the end of the conference. So if you do not have one and you would like one, please, please, please take it home. Hopefully you will enjoy it, drink many wonderful cups of coffee from it, and think good things about PQI while you're doing it. So this is the first time I'm standing up here. I'm the Deputy Director of PQI. I have the great pleasure of introducing our first public lecture for the conference. And the person who's going to be speaking to us today is Charlie Tahan. Dr. Charles Tahan is the Assistant Director for Quantum Information Science and the Director of the National Quantum Coordination Office within the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So that job sounds pretty important, and in fact, it really is. He's responsible for a lot of US quantum strategy, working closely with experts in many departments and agencies across the United States government. He is on detail from the Laboratory of Physical Sciences, where he drove technical progress in the future of information technology in multiple roles. In terms of formal science education, I encourage you to take a look online. But briefly, Charlie's trained in departments spanning the globe and gained experience by working in industry and at government agencies such as DARPA. You can look at details on the pqi.org webpage, of course, or if you prefer Wikipedia, you can decide which you trust more. Some of you may know that I had the pleasure of serving as the director of the Laboratory of Physical Sciences and working with Charlie quite a bit. So I just simply like to say that I have worked closely with Charlie over the years. He is a deep thinker, a strategic thinker, and a tremendous partner to work with. And I have enjoyed literally every minute that I have spent with this man. Without further ado, let me introduce our first public speaker, Charlie Tahan.
Good afternoon. It's really great to be here. Thank you, Rob. What can I say? Rob invited me to come give this talk. He proposed a very provocative title. I said, Rob, there's only one problem. I work in the government. I can't be provocative. So we compromised and settled on Quantum 2028. 2028 is the 10-year anniversary of the National Quantum Initiative Act when it was signed. Formally, that's when it ends. So I'm going to talk today about a few different subjects, but it's going to be in the context of looking forward of where we want to be in 10 years. I just want to say, at the beginning that, because I know there's a lot of students in the room, but I've had the great fortune of working at the intersection of quantum and governments for the last 15 years or so. Even back as a graduate student, I was being funded by government agencies. Of course, I didn't know that at the time. I was completely ignorant of how science funding worked. Eventually, I became a PI, getting money from NSF directly. Then I went to DARPA as a consultant. So there's this whole group of people who provide technical consulting to program managers in the government employees who run the big science funding programs. I helped DARPA start their quantum computing programs around that time. And then I decided to go into the government myself. So I went to NSA's Laboratory of Physical Sciences, which is the physical research arm of the research division at NSA, located at the University of Maryland. I started a research group, and for the last dozen years or so, I've run quantum computing programs, helping push the field forward. And then 2 years ago and change, I started to get very serious in policy. I came to the White House to lead the new National Quantum Initiative Act as its first director. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that today. So I want to start by just reminding you, at least why I think quantum information science matters. And then talk about the policy that we set in the US collectively to push the whole field forward. And then kind of go local to LPS to give you some examples, at least around my field, quantum computing, how these things are actually playing out. there's a good case to be made that quantum mechanics has really enabled, a lot of the prosperity that we take advantage of and maybe take for granted today. The transistor, the laser, magnetic resonance imaging, all these things are based on our understanding of quantum mechanics at the most basic level, the benign parts of quantum mechanics, that there are quantized particles, that there are energy levels. Just knowing those things lets you build devices that are really truly remarkable, and we depend on. And these physical devices let us manipulate information. So what man has done over the last 50, 60, 70 years is take those devices and build an abstraction on top of it. Zeros and ones that we think of when we think of computer science or information theory. What quantum information has done, starting around the 1980s by, a select group of weirdos, basically, who started thinking, well, if I start thinking about computer science, not based on this abstraction that man came up with, but by the real programming language of the universe, which is quantum mechanics. If I think of computers that way, what's different? And what they found was there's some pretty specifically significantly different things. And if you think about information theory from this concept of quantum mechanics, you get things like quantum computers, quantum sensors, quantum networks. So the most famous, the person who gets all the credits, as we typically do, is Richard Feynman, who asked a question that other people were asking as well. Well, nature solves quantum problems fast. Like if it wants to know the ground state of a molecule, it just does it, right? Whereas if I'm trying to simulate it on a classical computer, it tends to be hard. Namely, anytime I increase the size or add a molecule to a system I want to calculate, naively, it doubles the size of the system I need to diagonalize, the matrix I need to diagonalize. So what if we could make a quantum computer that would do that for us? Would it be much more efficient? So this is sort of one of the first ways of thinking about, at least from a physics perspective, why quantum computers would be more powerful. This is actually still quite an open topic in the sense that we don't really know how powerful a quantum computer really will be versus classical techniques, because classical quantum chemistry is extremely good, over, being developed over the last 50 years. It's good, and quantum computers are still not really big enough to play with. So we're still learning how good a quantum computer really could be for chemistry. I just want to settle on the definition of quantum information right from the start. If we call quantum 1.0 particles and energy levels, that's like the foundational implications of quantum mechanics. Quantum 2.0 or quantum information science is really these second order effects, entanglement, superposition, quantum measurements. And these enable new types of systems like quantum sensors and networks and computers. And this definition will just be important because, as we lay out what a national quantum initiative is, you could decide to go extremely broad and say everything quantum is in that. And then you get quantum materials, strongly correlated materials, superconductivity. But we decided not to do that. We tried to keep it within quantum information science and really tease out the what's new about this field that makes it a new separate thing, particularly in line with the technology that it may enable. Okay. At the end of the day, what I'm trying to say here is that I really believe quantum information science is a foundational shift in information technology, right? Zeros and ones are not the right way to think about computing. You really need to think about how the universe works. And quantum computers, especially at the large scale, are a great example of that. We have now 30 years of work in cryptanalysis showing that if you have a large scale quantum computer, it can break public key encryption, certain types of cryptography that for some reason humanity chose to build most of our economic infrastructure around. It could break that exponentially more quickly than a classical computer could. We also, strongly suspect that if you had a big quantum computer I mean, I believe this. I think every physicist will believe this, would say they would believe this. You can do new science with this thing. If somebody gave you a large quantum computer, you could do amazing new science with it. It'd be extremely interesting. And then there's a lot of growing evidence, although it's still kind of early days compared to cryptanalysis, that with a big enough computer, you can do new types of chemistry that will be useful, that will be economically useful, that people would use to make money or do something that you couldn't do now. That's what I call utility. So while quantum information, still relatively young fields, shifts in information technology don't happen very often. So you need to take them extremely seriously because, so much of our livelihood depends on IT. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you about the National Quantum Initiative and how things have built up and progressed and what we've been doing to kind of push this whole field of endeavor forward. I know there's a lot of people here who don't understand how the government works. None of us do. It's okay. But let me try to give you a basic 101. The United States is extremely unique. We have a very federal approach to science funding. We're a big country, whereas other countries may have a quantum czar who really decides all science funding. And I envy that person. No, I don't. We don't. We really have different agencies, the NSF, the DoD, which is like a country in and of itself, with multiple funding agencies like DARPA, the service labs, like Army Research Office, so on. Department of Energy, National Institute of Standards and Technology, National Science Foundation. We have many agencies that each have their own mission, which they fulfill. And the way that works is they come up with a plan according to their mission. My mission is to set standards for the country. I come up with a budget, I propose it to Congress, I work with Congress. Congress has got its own ideas might want to fund. And the president's office, the executive office of the president, where I work, they have their own ideas. So there's this complex dance to decide what is funded and what is not. And there's a lot of robustness in that approach because there's many different ways to do funding, there's many different opinions, and this model has served us very well over the last 50 years. But we do need a way to coordinate. And a lot of that coordination happens within the White House. There are subcommittees, both in OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the National Security Council, NSC, that coordinate directly. There are coordination offices like mine. There's only a few of them. And there's other Office of Management and Budget, which helps coordinate the budgets across the government. Those mechanisms allow everything to be kind of synergized regularly, but it takes work. Like it just doesn't happen for free, and that's by design. So I mentioned that in 2018, at the very end of 2018, Congress passed the National Quantum Initiative Act. President Trump at the time signed it. The NQI Act did a number of things. It legislated a subcommittee on quantum in the White House. It's created my office, the National Quantum Coordination Office. And the NQCO, as we've developed it, is actually quite unique. We have 5 people in it who are detailed or loaned to the White House, one from NSA, one from DoD, one from DOE, one from NIST, and one from NSF. It's quite unique compared to the other NCOs who typically have one person and a few contractors to support it. And this allows us to kind of coordinate and work together to make sure the whole effort is working. They created an advisory committee external to advise the president and a number of other things, a quantum industry consortium, as I'll talk about. The one thing that I want to say about this is that there are a lot of different agencies who not only fund quantum, but who ultimately care about what's going to come out of it. So if you think about like the Department of Homeland, DHS, or FBI, or US Patent and Trademark Office, they're all on our committee. Why? Because either they have a key enabling role, FBI protects domestic companies, USPTO wants to understand new patents, trademarks that are coming out of in this new field, or if you're like NIH or DHS, you want to ultimately use quantum technology for your mission, like to solve cancer or to protect the nation. So we have end users, we have R&D funding agencies, we have enabling tech agencies, they all come together and try to cohesively create a strategy. And that is our first task as a coordination office assigned by Congress, is to write a national strategy for this initiative. And that means corralling all these agencies to write one document. And you can imagine one document written by 13 agencies is a literary art. But I was the executive secretary at the time, so that was my job to kind of massage it. At the end of the day, it's held up pretty well over the last 4 years. We have 6 main policy thrusts, and these are really how we think about how we move quantum forward. Taking a science-first approach, meaning tackling the hard problems. Not working on the infrastructure before we solve the hard problems. Building the key infrastructure to enable that science and technology development. Building the workforce, which we knew at the time we needed, and it's only become a bigger problem over the last 4 years. Nurturing this new industry that's being developed. Building, balancing the economic and national security, because as I mentioned, quantum right from the beginning, it's always had this duality of its scientific interest and potential for economics, but also the risk of a quantum computer being used against us to break our communications. And then international cooperation, because quantum has always been a global enterprise, and we need to continue working with our friends and allies to explore this huge space. And over the last few years, we've added to this strategy by writing individual policy recommendations in areas like quantum sensing, quantum networking, to guide policymakers on what we should fund or not fund, what the agency should prioritize or not. And we've been pretty lucky in increasing the overall budget of quantum, doubling it over the last 2 years. You can find all this on quantum.gov. You can ask me some other time how hard it was to get quantum.gov. It's quite a it's quite a story. So to me, all those 6 things boil down to three big goals. One is getting the science rights. The second is enhancing US competitiveness. And the third is enabling our people. And by getting the science right, I really mean, tackling the hard problems. We call these the quantum frontiers, and it was really the first report we put together after we published the strategy. It took in data from public RFIs, requests for information about what the NQI should be doing, and also many workshops that the agencies held, and collated it into like the top 8 areas technically that we should focus on. And again, you have to think about the US model. The US model is not, here's the ground challenge for the country, let's go do this. It is, each agency has their mission: protect the nation, advance science, advance industry. According to that mission, what is your grand challenge? So you will find within each of these areas, like, oh, I'm DoD, I really care about precision navigation and timekeeping. I've got to solve this problem. So the grand challenge technical problems are really inside these areas. I encourage you to look at that if you're interested in what we think are the most important things. And then we started tackling kind of the big areas: networking, sensing, computing. And there's a reason we took this order. Networking, although BB84, quantum key distribution, is like the first proposed use for quantum technology, quantum networking is really the most immature in terms of funding and kind of direction, because we don't really know why you would build a quantum network or what would justify building a large quantum network right now. We strongly believe that in the future, when we have large quantum computers and we want to connect them together, a quantum network would be good. It would probably be good to have a quantum network if we want to connect quantum sensors. But we're still at the stage where we really need to understand the applications before committing to that kind of big investments. And so the recommendations kind of reflect that. And there's a lot of disagreement within the agencies. Some people say, well, QKD is not going to work, forget about all quantum networking. Others are like, well, this is a really interesting scientific topic. We don't know. We should really devote a lot of resources to it. So this report really sets the balance. Focus on right sides quantum test beds to understand the application space, and then work on the key components that we know we're going to need no matter what. High efficiency transducers between 2 qubit types, quantum repeaters, and so on. And then the last one, quantum sensors, has a very different feel, because here there's already been significant work on building quantum sensors, and quantum clocks, if you think of them as a sensor, are already, we're already dramatically reliant on them for global positioning system and other things. People have been working on sensors for medical imaging and so on. Really, where we are there is, how do we get these sensors from the lab to markets? And there, you really need agencies to pick up the ball and start funding at 10, 100 times research levels to prove these things into development. And so that really is what the Sensors to Fruition report is about. Okay, 2, enhancing competitiveness. And here, what we really mean is, how do we make the development of this technology matter to people faster while ensuring that our companies and our country are protected? We don't cause harm, because at the end of the day, the government has these dual responsibilities. A big thing that the NQI Act did was call on NIST to create an economic development consortium or industry consortium that now has 140 companies, another 30, 50 nonprofit organizations that are a part of it. It's been quite successful at coordinating US industry. It also includes a lot of international companies. So that's been a big success. Another thing that kind of goes in parallel to that is, what is our strategy for interacting with the rest of the world? A lot of these concepts in quantum information came from other countries. We completely acknowledge that. We in the US are dependent on foreign talent, so we want to keep that going. How do we, build up and continue to push our great relationships with other people around the world? And in that vein, we've been signing quantum cooperation statements with a number of countries to kind of work that out. And then the third thing is enabling our people. At the end of the day, that's why people are elected in the White House and why congressmen and congresswomen are elected. How do we make it better for people? Both in new jobs and new opportunities, but also in the technology that will make people's lives better. So we spent a long time working across the agency, developing a workforce strategy. And to me, it's sort of this first box up here. It starts with having great careers. In quantum, we can keep a number of how many job openings there are, and it's a lot and it's growing. But communicating that to people, saying this is a great career for your kids to go do, is really important. It's something that the White House can really amplify what's going on across the country. And then working back from that, how do we inspire people to go into STEM? How do we educate them, and then give them the unique experiences to show them, like whether it's a summer school or an internship, that they can contribute. That there are many different areas where you can contribute, and they can contribute to this field. I mean, all these things are modeled on like what we in the office and all the people working in the agencies have experienced in our own lives. The things that have made us stay in science. Another thing we've done is launch the Quantum Education Partnership, or the Q12, the K-12. We're all about the cool Q things. Q12 Education Partnership. And the idea here is to create an external body of the big companies and the small companies who really care about quantum computing and quantum technology, but also education, and help them develop curriculum and curated materials for high school and below. Give high school students free access to quantum computers, develop curriculum at all different levels, and then work across the U.S. educational system, which often means states, to get some curriculum into kids' classes. Whether it's a one-day kit that teachers will teach, like on World Quantum Day, and we launched World Quantum Day. U.S. as a participant this year. We had like 300 schools that did a one hour quantum lesson. It was pretty successful. We have a cool video you can go see. I didn't get the Marvel superheroes this year, but maybe next year. All this stuff kind of matters, right? This is the stuff that's going to enable us to be leaders in the future, and also make Americans better off. And that's really what we're going to be judged on at the end. I just want to add one more thing to this talent thing, because there's actually two subcommittees. Quantum is quite unique. We have two subcommittees in the White House on quantum. One is led by the civilian agencies, DOE, NSF, and NIST. The other is focused on the economic and security implications of quantum, because quantum, again, has this kind of dual use you have to be serious about. And this report, the Role of International Talent, was the first report that that subcommittee came out with. It was a really a reaction to some things that were going on 2 years ago in terms of restricting visas for certain institutions coming from China, military fusion schools. And the question was, well, should that be expanded? And we wanted to ask the question, well, one, how dependent in the US are we on foreign talents? Is that a good thing? And then what should the agencies be doing? What should we be doing as a nation? And the answers were yes, we're dependent. I don't think that's a surprise. Yes, it's very much a good thing. We want people to come to the US and study here, go back, stay. And in terms of recommendations, really what it's worth reading. What it says is, we need to take a measured approach to research security. We can't overdo it. We need to be cognizant of a new world that's more competitive and of people who want to, of countries that want to do Americans harm, but we have to take a measured approach to research security because this model we've created of an open academic environment that moves forward quickly is just better overall. It works. Another thing the NQCO is responsible for is engagements with universities, with companies, with public and private entities. In the fall, we hosted the first Quantum Industry Summit. This is actually the first big in-person event that this administration, OSTP, hosted. There's still a lot of COVID protocols. So we got as many people in the room as we could. We had about 30 people in the room, 18 companies. And we talked about these issues, workforce, how do we move the technology forward while protecting it? And we just listened to what the industry was hearing. That was a quite successful event, and it's resulted in quantum being included in a lot of legislation that's come down the pike since then. At the end of the day, the questions we get are, why does quantum matter? Senior leaders in agencies and the White House want to know, well, why would I build a quantum computer? What are the applications, right? So we try, even though this is a new field and those are still open questions most of the time, to quantify, at least at a granular level, where certain technologies will be very impactful, even existential to our society, compared to others that still is sort of the demo stage. So you can think of GPS clocks. I couldn't get home tomorrow if I didn't have my iPhone. We think of quantum computers. If somebody had one right now and we haven't upgraded our cryptography, we'd be in real trouble, right? So these things are existential. And then the others are, we think there's real applications. We don't know the full extent yet, and we're learning. So if you take an example of quantum computing where the applications are still kind of nascent and we don't know how big a quantum computer you'll need to do something useful, or if it were able to, really beat the best classical high performance computer you can get access to nowadays, but you can still try to ask these questions and take a long-term view. And the thing I try to stress is, I don't care what the answer is. If you tell me the quantum computer has to be this big, it's millions of qubits, blah, 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 it's going to take this long, that's fine. That's a great answer. I'd much rather know than believe that with 20 qubits, I can do something, that I can't do with a classical computer. So if I had my dream, I would have a chart like this, increasingly high fidelity, which kind of tells us as the size of the machine grows, the quality of the machine, the material, the applications, we understand what that system could be applied to. And then this kind of justifies increasing investments in development over the next decade. But this is just art's conception, right? It's not reality. I don't think this is the reality. Okay, and that takes me to the first strategy for quantum computing. We left quantum computing for last because in many respects, quantum computing has been invested in by the agencies for 20, 30 years almost. There's significant investment in industry. There's a lot of pretty mature thinking about it. But we really had to do something, because number one, although it might be far off, we don't know. It could be 10 years, it could be 30 years, it could be more. So we have a cryptanalytically relevant quantum computer. The consequences of it are such that you really need to think about moving the nation to post-quantum cryptography or quantum-resistant cryptography. So the National Security Memorandum, which is a presidential directive, like an executive order, which came out in May, really had 3 points. The first one is, look, we understand the risks of the quantum computer, but we still think the US has to move as fast as we can in quantum information science and technology R&D, because overall, the benefits greatly outweigh the risks. So that means continuing R&D investment, increasing it, expand workforce development programs, strengthen partnerships with our allies and like-minded nations. But then we also have to prioritize moving the nation to quantum-resistant cryptography. And here this is why it's a presidential directive. It says agency X, you need to do this by this date. Agency Y, you need to do this by this date. And if you look at past cryptographic transitions, they can take anywhere from 10 years, if you do it right, to never. Right? And never is not something we can allow given the risk. And the third thing is, like, in the meantime, we need to protect our investments. We need to find clever ways and smart ways to do that. So this is sort of the reasoning behind it. We don't know we've not discovered any physics no-goes for building a large-scale quantum computer. And because it takes so long to transition to a new cryptographic system, we have to take the threat seriously, and we need to develop a strategy to move it, over a certain amount of time to a new standard while protecting our R&D and our companies. Okay, so I'll just end this sort of policy part with an event we hosted at the White House in last May, where we brought together 12 countries who have quantum strategies of their own to really share with each other what our strategies were and how we came up with them and why, and then talk about what our next steps were a multilateral collection of countries could do together to advance the field. Can we create clearinghouses for postdoc opportunities and fellowships and sabbaticals? Can we work together to make sure export controls make sense and are coordinated? Can we, pursue R&D joint funding and so on? So this is the first step to that, and it was a very nice meeting. We were in this really cool room at the White House, the diplomatic room. Everybody was really happy to be in person. It makes a difference, right? All right, so that's the first part. So now we're to Quantum 2028, and so we're 4 years and change into the NQI almost, and we have to start thinking about the reauthorization. Actually, the NQI Act calls on Congress to reauthorize it at 5 years. So what would it look like? And then even after that, when we look back, where would we want the science to be? Where would we want the technology to be? Where will our people are people better off? Because of this 10-year investment. Is the country safer or less safe? Is the technology more mature or less? These are the questions we ask ourselves, and it's actually a very timely question to ask, because just this Friday we are having all the program managers across the government, like 150 people, come for PQI's program day and talk about not only the programs we're doing now, but what would NQI 2.0 look like? So it's very much in our mind. And I guess in that vein, I just want to say what I like to say, which is that quantum is more than quantum. You can ask the question, well, quantum is kind of narrow. Why? We don't know the implications of it. And I guess my response is twofold. One, shifts in information technology don't happen every day. You got to take it seriously. We have some examples that are pretty big. There'll be more. And two, if you think about the skill sets needed to build a large quantum computer or large quantum sensor system, what do you need? You need to know quantum physics, computer science, RF engineering, microelectronics, cryogenics, systems engineering. I think you'll be okay if you learn that stuff, right? That's not a bad investment. Like if somebody comes out of school with that skill set and quantum dies for some reason, they'll get a job, right? In autonomy, in AI, robotics, microelectronics, these are the industries of the future. And we do ourselves well by investing more in it one way or another. Okay, so now I'm going to go local. So I told you sort of how we think about it at the national level. I have another job, which is director of the LPS Qubit Collaboratory, which is one of the QIS research centers that the NQI stood up. I should say that as part of the National Quantum Initiative, it called on NSF to set up new national quantum information science centers, as well as DOE. So they each set up 5. DOEs are each about 25 million a year, NSFs are about 5 million a year. And then the next year, the National Defense Authorization Act, which is sort of the DoD equivalent, where all the DoD agencies are funded, that authorized DoD to set up their own centers or label centers. So there's actually 3, 2 DoD and 1 IC, and the LPS one is LPS Qubit Collaboratory. So here's the start, which is, the computer I made this on, I looked it up, has 16 billion transistors, the M1 chip. You have to ask yourself, why was this easy to make, right? And by easy, I don't mean easy, I mean possible. So over the last 50, 60 years, whatever it is, humanity has done this thing, which is amazing. They made the 16 billion transistor chip. And I'll argue that there's 2 reasons for it. One is, there's more reasons, but here's 2. One is digital logic. And that's the sense that I've come up with a system where I have analog devices, like I have a voltage from 0 to 1 volts, say, but I just decide that anything below some value is 1 and anything above some value is 0. So that there's a lot of resilience to something being, it doesn't have to be 0.2, 0.3, it's always 1, right? There's a lot of resilience built into that model of computation, to the 10 to the minus 20 error per, operation, like ridiculous amount of resilience. That's not all. The other thing that's amazing about the M1 chip is that if you look in the backside of it, and it turns out there's companies who like deconstruct chips, like and sell you the information. I didn't buy this, but it was on Google. This is the M1 chip reversed and etched down to see how many contact pads it has. It has about 3,000, if I counted right, wires that come out to the world. So 3,000 wires for 16 billion devices. We call that a mux ratio, and that's like millions, right? It's huge. And that's the miracle. And both of these things don't happen for quantum. That's what makes building a quantum computer hard. LPS is one of the 2 or 3 funding agencies that have been funding quantum computing for 25 years, since 1993, 1994. LPS funds, I think, 100 principal investigators across 40 institutions, really around the world. So the reason I say that is I want to talk about timelines. We think about, if you open a newspaper and you say, well, quantum computer company X is doing this, blah, blah, blah. We're going to have this thing delivered by 2 years from now. For a program manager in quantum computing, 5 years, 2028, or like that's tomorrow. Like time happens in some sense very slow in this technology. And I just want to kind of explain why. But on the other hand, on the security side, you have to take it seriously, because once things do start moving technologically, they move very quickly. Let me give you an example. Like for World Quantum Day, April 14th, I think it's April 14th, Planck's constant. I used DALL-E, OpenAI's DALL-E, to help illustrate a blog post I made. I had to beg some friends to give me access, beta access. It was really cool. Fast forward 6 months, and I was just looking at Hacker News. I can download an installer to get Stable Diffusion on my M1 and do it for free. So things move quite quickly these days. But I'm just going to explain why quantum is hard, and things haven't moved as quickly as people have thought. So just to remind people who are kind of new to this field, From transistors, we go to qubits in quantum information science. This is basically all you need to know about quantum mechanics to think about quantum computing. Qubits are two-level systems. They're controlled with analog pulses. They're analog devices. They require two complex numbers to describe, not one bit. When you measure them, you only get one bit of information, however. That's quantum measurements. And you can put these together, you get superposition or entanglement. Very much today, we are still in there are many different ways to build a quantum computer. I'm particularly interested in solid state implementations like superconducting qubits you heard about earlier today, spin-based qubits. There are other approaches based on atomic, molecular, and optical systems. All these things could realize a quantum computer. We don't know which yet. First of all, we don't know how big a quantum computer you need to do something good or useful. Although we have, examples. And ultimately, we're still learning how, each of these things have benefits and pluses and minuses. I'll just say 20 years ago when LPS started investing in qubit types, there were more than this. There were like 20 different types. A lot of these got cut out, but some of them come back to life. Like photonics have been left for dead. Cold atoms have been left for dead. In the last 3 years, they've kind of come back. So, we're still kind of early days in terms of what will ultimately realize a quantum computer, and that has to, go into your thinking about timelines. The other thing you need to know about quantum computing is that although the qubits are analog, quantum computers are digital. And it's just kind of a happy coincidence or happenstance of quantum mechanics, because it's linear, errors add, they don't multiply. So there's really only 3 types of errors that can happen to a qubit. It can flip, it can phase flip, and it can do both. And you can devise quantum error correction schemes that don't measure the qubits while correcting these 3 errors. And if you can correct any of these 3 errors, you can correct by net rotations. So this point that quantum computers are digital is a really important one for people who think back to analog computing, where the errors multiply very quickly and it became just non-tractable. That's not the case for quantum computing. So this is how we think about the quantum computing challenge. You're given, your quantum algorithm friend or expert gives you the algorithm in logical space that they want you to calculate. It might take 1,000 perfect qubits, 10 to the 12 operations to do something interesting in chemistry. Just take that as an input. But you need to bridge the gap between the physical devices and the logical errors. If you think of, because this is a probabilistic machine, if I have to do 20 to 12 operations, then roughly each operation has to have an error rate of 10 to the minus 12, right? Physical qubits right now, and in the foreseeable future, have an error rate of 10 to the minus 2, 10 to the minus 3, maybe 10 to the minus 4 one day. So we're talking about, 10 to the 8 to 10 to the 14 orders of magnitude better error rates that we need to actually do computation. And we need to bridge that gap as quantum error correction. We need more qubits per. So every logical qubit will need some number of physical qubits, which could be thousands. And that makes your machine. So you need a lot of qubits is the end goal. And if you look at where we are, Shor's algorithm was discovered in 1930, which really motivated 1993, which really motivated a lot of the funding in this field. Starting around 2000, DARPA and the IC started funding big programs to build qubits. And around 10 years later, the first good qubits were demonstrated, 2-qubit gates. And then about 5 years after that, the first VC companies and big companies started investing or building groups or buying out groups from universities. And now we're kind of at the place where we have pretty cool 50 to 100 qubit systems that you can run algorithms on, through the cloud that work, but the fidelity is still, 10 to the minus 2 kind of area. And that's 50 qubits. And we think, for factoring, for example, you need around 10 million or more. And what it comes down to is building a quantum computer is not about just making the qubits better or making one aspect better. It's really a holistic problem that's very difficult. And that difficulty comes, again, top 2 things. The qubits have to be good, which means there's a lot of material science that has yet to be, solved for making really good qubits. And each of those qubits needs a lot of attention. MUX doesn't work so well, where you have analog qubits that need to be touched a lot for error correction. So roughly you need n wires per qubit, where n could be 1 to 10. Quantum dots need a lot of wires to work. Superconducting qubits less so. Atomic qubits need lasers, which add a lot of other problems. But you need a lot of wires per qubit. You can parallelize it maybe factor of 10, but that doesn't buy you much when you need millions or tens of millions or even more for some algorithms. So there's a lot of interconnect, and I just told you the state-of-the-art interconnects, it's like 3,000 wires. So I'm talking about millions now. So that's a huge problem. And then you have to do all of this in some kind of exotic environment, either 50 millikelvin in a dilution refrigerator or in vacuum, magnetic shielding, and so on and so on. So all these things have to come together into a system that's never been created before, right, to work. I'll just say one more thing. One thing that people new to the field or people coming from engineering like to bring up is like, why don't we do a roadmap? Like, people always want to do roadmaps, and especially internationally, it's always something like, let's work at a roadmap together. And I say, great, I love roadmaps. But we did it in 2000. If you go back to 2000, there's a lot of really great roadmaps for quantum computing, and they're still good. I mean, the error corrections have changed a little bit, and if you look at them, we're on like step 4 of 25. It's kind of amazing. We're going on the path, but the timeframes are way beyond what we thought. I remember as a grad student, I got one of the first grants from LPS. I didn't know it at the time. And our goal was to have a 2-qubit gate in silicon, quantum dots, in 3 years. This is 2001. It took 18 years to get a 2-qubit gate silicon. 18 years. Took 18 years, right? And so the time frames between each of those milestones, they looked very small at the time. Okay, you need 1 qubit, then you need 10, then you need 100 for a logical qubit, then you need 1,000 to do multiple. It kind of made total sense, but it just, when you got to the meat of it, it went a lot slower. That's not to say that it won't change dramatically at some point, right? That at some point we're going to get to 1,000. Yeah, we solved it. We just need to tile it, but it hasn't happened that way yet. Okay, so we'll see. So there are many different qubits. Now I'm sort of going to give you just a flavor for the people in the know of what we care about at LPS and what I care about. I made this thing called the qubit zoo, but I care a lot about superconductor qubits and superconducting qubits and how to make them better together. One of my favorite types of qubits is the silicon quantum dot qubit. Here you have a single electron with a spin. It could be pointing up, it could be pointing down, spin 1/2 electron. That's your qubit. Just call up 1, call down 0. You trap those in a little box in a semiconductor. It looks very much like a MOSFET, metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistor, but for 1 electron, right? And really cold. You make it cold enough, it becomes a quantum dot with discrete energy levels. 2-qubit gates are done by just overlapping the electrons in the Pauli exclusion principle. Because they're fermions, they don't like each other, so they rotate. And you can use that to do entangling gates. And you can build up like a little quantum abacus, a quantum computer. And over the last 24 years since we first proposed, 1998, we are now at the point where we have 6 dots that look pretty good. This is a 6-dot device on the right here. There's also, this is from HRL, there's some from Princeton University and TU Delft, have similar setups. 6 dots, 40 pulses, can do a controlled NOT gate with, 90, almost, 99% fidelity, which is pretty impressive. But that's taken a lot of investment and time. And one of the things that's nice about semiconductors, and this kind of comes from the heritage of lasers, and solid state lasers, is we know how to grow crystals epitaxially. So we can grow silicon as a perfect crystal, silicon germanium, which has a slightly different band gap, and it's a perfect crystal with a perfect interface. This is one big perfect crystal. And we know, we've done the measurements, that it's very lossless to electric fields. So the qubits don't like charge noise. Spin qubits by themselves are very protected by charge noise. That's why we like them. But when you interact them with each other, they become very sensitive to charge noise. So if you move the dielectrics away, things get better. That's why semiconductors are nice. They're also nice because they're fermions, and you can kind of create your own molecules. You can say, I can make a qubit out of 1 electron, 2 electrons, 3 electrons, and a lot of different properties. And that's one of the things we do in our group is think about new ways to make molecular qubits out of dots that might have nice properties. And just as an example, lately we've been thinking about another paradigm for computing, which doesn't use these sensitive control pulses, but just uses measurements only, coupled with some exchange gates to do all computation a little bit more efficiently. And there's a lot of actual other work, if you haven't been following it, out of Majorana qubits that is very similar and quite interesting. Also relevant to photonic computing. This fusion-based measurement approaches might be very efficient for quantum computing. And then there's superconducting qubits. So you've heard about those today. They're one of the more popular choices for companies, especially startup companies, because they're much easier to make. Whereas quantum dots are roughly 10, 20 nanometers on the side and require 10 nanometer gates and many overlapping layers to make these structures. Superconducting qubits are actually can be really big. They're quite big. They require a single layer of metal. They're talking about microns instead of nanometers. And you can really take advantage of microwave, very good quality microwave sources to do operations and readout and so on. This is the transmon, probably the most famous type of qubit, the transmon qubit. And this is one that Google used to do its quantum supremacy experiments. And I'll just mention, and it's already talked about earlier today, that quantum supremacy experiment is really tour de force. They had 50 qubits with couplers in between to enable 2 qubit gates. They weren't quite 2 qubit gates to photonic quantum computing, but you could run these kind of longish experiments to show effects of this bigger Hilbert space you have with 50 qubits. And kind of the hidden gem in this paper is the coupler, because the coupler, which is basically another transmon qubit between 2 of the data qubits, allows you to turn off coupling. And turning off coupling is the thing that's the secret to scaling. How do you turn things off? One of the problems with big electric dipole qubits, which have a flux loop, is that there's a lot of crosstalk, right? If you're turning on a flux line here to tune your qubits, it's going to affect other qubits. How do you tune all that up? It gets very hard. So one of the things we are interested in is how to combine kind of the best properties of both superconductors and semiconductors into new systems. Superconductors are heterogeneous by design, right? They're huge. There's many different metals. There's substrates. There's vacuum. There's a lot of oxides everywhere. Ultimately, that noise will matter to the qubits. So could you make superconductors epitaxial? That's an open question. Can you design superconducting qubits using some of the ideas of this encoding or molecular type of approach to quantum computing? Here's an idea we had of, instead of using a single qubit as your qubit, use 2 pairs, so the dual rail qubits. If you do it this way, you don't need any microwave sources. You can do everything with baseband pulses, which makes your control electronics much easier to scale. Again, it's a holistic problem, right? You might double the number of qubits you have to deal with, but I have a lot less electronics to buy. That's another idea. We implemented that recently with MIT in a collaboration where we also showed that you could make superconducting composite qubits that operate at like near the effective temperature, even with 3 nines fidelity. So these kind of ideas are things we're interested in exploring as potential ways to disrupt the current approaches to quantum computing. The other is, can we make epitaxial superconductors? Can we combine a metal with a semiconductor and make them one system which has very low loss, and then utilize the processes of the semiconductor to do things, make it compatible with CMOS, for example, because it's voltage tunable now instead of flux tunable. This is the newest MBE system we bought at LPS. LPS has got a huge investment in molecular beam epitaxy and epitaxial systems. This little thing in the middle is a robot that lets you move between the superconducting side and the semiconductor side, so you can do all types of different materials. And these are some examples of Chris Richardson's group where he's trying to make, first of all, epitaxial Josephson junctions straight up, and then also these exotic supersemi devices. We had this idea a few years earlier, God, it's like 5 years earlier now, where if you could make a superconductor inside the semiconductor like silicon, and there is experimental evidence that if you dope silicon high enough with boron, you can make it go superconducting. If you could do that in 3D, like with scanning tunneling microscopy, then you could make very small, completely epitaxial superconducting devices. And you could even imagine making a parallel plate transmon. And if you think about this the reason people don't do parallel plate transmons now is because the oxides are lossy. Actually, since we published this, there's been a few attempts at making them. They're actually not that bad, actually, even in aluminum oxide. But if you could do it completely epitaxially, it could be that you could shrink the size of the qubit by 1,000 and make it better. So 1,000 times smaller is really good for scaling. Right now, instead of having football field qubits, you have a 200 millimeter wafer. So look, this is a miracle that need to be solved material science wise, but this is the kind of this is why it's fundamental research and why we're doing it. And in fact, we launched a whole program called Next, which we have members here who are participating in, new and emerging qubits, which are trying to do different variants of this. Okay, maybe it won't work in silicon, but let's make a 2D stack of 2D materials, hexaboron nitride as the insulator, a superconducting 2D material, make a stack like that. Maybe you can make a qubit like that, or maybe you could use flip chip engineering. There's a whole bunch of different ideas. If any of those pan out, it's really, a disruptive step forward. I'll just say at the end, I have a very talented postdoc who's working on, what could you do on arrays of qubits that aren't quite fault tolerant computers yet, right? So he helped MIT design a 4x4 array and is doing out of time correlators and other very interesting physics with many body systems. Okay, so in the last few minutes, I just want to tell you about the collaboratory. This is a brainchild that came about when the National Quantum Initiative came about. And we asked ourselves, what can our contribution be? This is before I went to the White House. What could our contribution be to the national affair? And what we came up with, LPS had been a big funder of quantum computing across the world. We had a small, relatively small internal research groups focused on doing research in-house. We said the new thing here is, one, using our experience with qubits to pursue really disruptive ideas, like the hard things that universities won't necessarily tackle, like very different new material systems. Second, we have a responsibility to help develop the quantum workforce. In the government, it's been extremely hard to hire the last few years because we're competing with Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and so on. So how do we give people an experience working in the government to show like this is an awesome place to work? You can have tremendous impacts in this career, way beyond what you might be able to get somewhere else. How do we give people that experience? And then a new model, can we create a truly collaborative research partnership? So instead of the typical thing that the government does of putting out so-called BAA, a broad agency announcement, where we say like, we want 4 qubits, they need to be this good, tell us how you're going to get there, and then we'll give you the money. This is more, here's the problem we care about. Tell us if you care about that problem and why you would be good to work with. And then let's work together on a proposal to solve that problem. So it's a very different model for collaborative research. And we have a new type of contract vehicle that the Army Research Office helped develop for us, where we can actually co-create ideas and IP and tackle some of these hard problems. So the LQC really creates these new vehicles and creates new fellowships for graduate students and postdocs, with 1 summer spent at LPS working with a scientist. It creates these new collaboratory proposals, which are joint projects, and it creates incubator and sabbatical opportunities, where if you just say, I have this idea, or I want to come visit or use your fridge for a while, you can just submit a proposal and come do that. And through this, we've also made massive investments in our infrastructure, about 2 e-beams, many fridges, a lot of metrology equipment. And we put out the first set of problems a year or so ago, kind of aligned with things I've talked about, how does epitaxy really affect qubits? Like, is that really going to matter or not? Could we make voltage controllable superthin qubits, like gate mons, if we know that those are, but better? Can we make higher temperature qubits that are compatible with scaling? Can we make spin qubits faster? Can we democratize the access to doing spin qubit physics? And then the last one might be interesting because it's quite unique. We actually want to fund the development of learning. So how can we train quantum information practitioners faster? Like, when we do research into that, like to develop a new course to get people open-ended experiences doing quantum experiments so that they learn and can get up to speed faster in this field. We also launched a qubit foundry. And again, with this idea, like if we want to move the field forward, we need more people doing physics experiments, and less having to worry about building a new fab when they get to a professorship or buying, fab equipment. So we'll give you the qubits. And we have Lincoln Laboratory under contract. We have a few others approaching contract. And here's just a couple ideas. One is use a flip chip. Instead of making your dots the way I showed you before in the traditional MOSFET approach, let's make 2 chips and do a flip chip approach to making dots. I don't have to destroy the wafer under test. I could test a lot of different materials. We're working on that in collaboration at the moment with Sandia, University of Texas, LPS, and HRL. We have a prototype version based on a scanning tunneling microscope, which actually induces the dots on the surface of a silicon wafer and then measures it all through one wire. So you can do everything through one wire. And the idea being, well, I can try silicon, then I can try germanium, I can try 2D materials. It would really accelerate the field. And then the other approach is like, maybe I'll do it with flip chips so that I can put any wafer on a flip chip and I can just send it off for measurement. So that's one project. Another is super germanium, trying to make proximatized germanium transmon-ish like qubits, but really trying to get to the nature of the materials interface. So we're growing the germanium quantum wells at LPS with an epitaxial aluminum cap and making devices and trying to understand the theory of the weak link. Because actually there's not a tremendous amount of work of really understanding as a function of the transparency through this weak link junction, what really happens and how can you integrate that into a quantum circuit. So we have a whole group between Lincoln and my group working on the theory of that. And one of the things we've most recently published was, again, taking this 3D chip engineering approach to transmon qubits. And instead of making a really big planar qubit, let's make it vertical. So you imagine the transmon qubit is planar. We make the capacitors, which are these green things, vertical. That shrinks the qubit by a factor of about 100, but it also enables us to use it as sort of a probe. I can make qubits much faster in this approach. It also is compatible with super semi junction. So this is actually a picture of a gate-mon-like transmon qubit with a germanium quantum well, which has very minimal processing, just one layer of metal, which has an orange DC voltage line that can tune the weak link junction, and then 2 green capacitors, which are galvanically connected to the yellow metal pads, which are more or less the transmon part of the qubit, the capacitor, shunting capacitor. And we showed you can do 2 qubit gates and so on. So a tremendous amount of cool things to do. And in the end, it's about measuring and learning more qubits because there's still a lot of science to be solved. So I'll just end in the last 5 minutes by talking about the future, which I promised to. And I'll just talk about the opportunities, the things that are happening in the government, just even in the last 6 months. We've had 2 organizations stand up from scratch. ARPA-H, which is the health DARPA. Actually, a former colleague of mine from Booz Allen just became the director. So we're really excited about it. We're hoping that ARPA-H will pick up the ball in quantum sensing for perhaps medical applications or imaging. That would be a great thing. And then the NSF launched a technology directorate, the Technology Innovation and Partnerships Directorate, which was recently just legislated in the Chips and Science Act. That is tasked with really trying to bring, over the next 5 years, scientific accomplishments to market. So that's also a good opportunity, I think, for quantum technology developments. And then the CHIPS and Science Act is a big deal. You know, the U.S. passed 52 billion and appropriated 52 billion for new fabs in the country for advanced node CMOS. But what you may not realize is that about 10 billion of that is allocated to the National Semiconductor Technology Center and Advanced Packaging Institute and other commons or regional industry hubs, which will enable research and development of new types of technologies. We're working to make sure that quantum is a part of that, as you know, other beyond Moore's technologies. That's a tremendous opportunity. And the Science Act actually authorizes really big investments for increases in NSF, DOE, and other labs. We'll see how those plan out, but it's, you know, it could be quite transformative for science funding in this country. And then the last thing is, like, and this is something I ask everybody, you know, what would you like to see in the next 5 years of the NQI? What's missing? It's something that's on our minds. And as we talk to Congress and the other stakeholders, we're trying to have good information, you know, good coordination of, you know, what we think is missing and what we haven't done, we should have been doing already. So with that, I'm out of words, and thank you very much again for having me, and I appreciate it, and happy to take questions.
So I think we have time for a question or two. Well, I'll jump in with the first one. So I saw that beautiful picture of the White House and all the strategists from across the globe sitting there.
Nobody got COVID that day.
Nobody got COVID that day, an excellent thing. You know, when you were listening to other countries' strategies, was there anything that surprised you or made you think, oh, this is a really good thing that we might want to add to our strategy?
It's funny, a lot of the, we're fortunate to be kind of a first mover. So a lot of the countries are thinking about how to create a coordination office like we have, because it's very unusual to have that. But one thing that we don't do that other countries do a lot of is industrial policy. You know, so many countries think of science funding as how to help their companies, whereas we are kind of more, we don't choose winners. You know, that's really the US approach. So the question I think going forward is, like, how do we, or should we do more industrial policy to help fund the companies as they develop? What are the investments that will help create opportunities for all the companies, or in a fair manner? So CHIPS is an opportunity for that. Science Act is an opportunity for that. But that's what I saw. Like, we don't typically do that, but maybe we need to do more of it.
Interesting, interesting. Is there another question? Yes, one over here.
GNC companies. So I guess where do you expect the first to see Quant have a big impact or a widespread use in the economy? Where kind of the first areas make a benefit from QIS?
Depends what you mean by quantum.
So repeat.
Yeah. So the question is, where would you see the first quantum information science realizations in industry, more or less? I think it does depend on what do you mean by quantum. Certainly, like in the NSM 10 on quantum computing, it directs the agencies to move to post-quantum cryptography. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities for computer sciencey companies who are helping the agencies know what their network's vulnerabilities are and then implement the NIST standards for PQC. So, I mean, that's not quantum necessarily, but it's definitely quantum inspired. So that's going to be huge. I mean, that's going to be a very expensive transition, first of all. And then, you know, quantum sensing in the near term, you know, it depends on what you mean by quantum information science, but there's a lot of bubbling quantum sensor companies that kind of, I think will start to have big, real impacts for precision navigation and timekeeping, even more so to today, perhaps for health applications. And then we're trying to understand quantum computing, right? We'll see. It's hard to predict because of the heuristic algorithms that are out there. We don't know until we've got it whether they're going to work. So we'll see. Yeah.
All right, I think with that, let's thank Charlie one more time. We have a poster session starting in about 1 minute. You have to walk up the fancy stairs. There's about 50 posters from students at Pitt, CMU, West Virginia University, and multiple other universities as well.